So today we're going to cover Module 48, which is anxiety disorders. So what are anxiety disorders? The major ones that are included in the DSM are GAD, or generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, specific phobias, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll go into what each of these are and then some of the different theories as to why people develop anxiety. So generalized anxiety disorder is a general sense of worry, where you're worrying more days than not for at least 6 months at a time. So people who have GAD kind of have this free-floating anxiety. They worry about, everything, and they spend more than 50% of the time worrying. They often have muscle tension, headaches, they have difficulty sleeping. We've all experienced this at some point in our lives, but it becomes a disorder when it's occurring for at least 6 months at a time, and it's significantly interfering with your ability to function in your daily life. You can have the cognitive symptoms, which we already discussed, or the physical symptoms, which are kind of the arousal, like the flight or flight. And this is actually not very healthy for you because those hormones are designed to, save you from attack. But if you're constantly having them in your body, it can cause negative effects on your body. So things like sweating, trembling, fidgeting, agitation, sleep disruption. So people have panic disorder. It's more than just having a panic attack. A panic attack is where in a period of a few minutes you get to the point where you're having difficulty breathing, you feel like you're about to die, your heart is racing, things like that. Many people will have one panic attack. It becomes panic disorder when you have recurrent attacks, or you start fearing that you're going to have recurrent attacks, and then you do things to change your behavior so as to avoid these recurrent attacks. A panic attack can include many minutes of intense dread or terror, and despite evidence to the contrary, people often believe that they're having a heart attack or they're about to die because they have chest pains, numbness, other frightening physical sensations. And I've seen people who've had many, many, many panic attacks, and they know they have panic attacks, but when they're in the midst of it, they really believe they're going to have a heart attack and they're going to die, and they end up in the hospital. There's a feeling of a need to escape. And as I said, panic disorder refers to repeated and unexpected panic attacks, as well as fear of the next attack. And that's the key thing, is that anticipatory fear, fearing that you're going to have it again. So in order to be diagnosed with panic disorder, you have to have that fear and the change of behavior to avoid situations where you think attacks may occur. All of us probably have some sort of specific phobia. I can tell you that looking at that snake and that spider did not make me happy. I don't know that I have a specific phobia in the sense that I could be in the same room as those things, wouldn't be happy about it, but I could. A specific phobia is diagnosed when there's an uncontrollable, irrational, intense desire to avoid some object or situation. So, for example, I see people who are afraid of bridges, and even though they need to take a bridge to go to work, they will drive 2 hours out of their way just so they don't have to take a bridge. Or people who live here in the Northeast where there really are no poisonous snakes, who will refuse to leave the house for fear of being attacked by a snake. For them, even an image like the ones you're looking at right now can cause a very strong reaction. The uncontrollable, irrational, and intense desire to avoid the object or the phobia. So it also has to start interfering with your daily life, and you have to, your life has to change because of it. Many people do not like clowns, but since we do not encounter clowns in our daily lives, it doesn't really affect us. But if your life starts to change because of your fear of encountering clowns, that's when you might consider that you have a phobia. So what things do people fear, and which ones are phobias? So you can see that we fear a lot of things, like being alone, storms, water, closed spaces, flying, blood, heights, and animals. So a lot of people have these kinds of fears, but that they're actually full-blown phobias kind of across the board are significantly lower, less than 5%. So agoraphobia is the avoidance of situations in which one fears having a panic attack, especially situations with their difficulty to get help. So it's also the fear of large, kind of open spaces. So people who have panic disorder with agoraphobia will refuse to leave their house because they're afraid that when they go into these large spaces, they're going to have a panic attack. Social phobia refers to the intense fear of being watched or judged by other people. So oftentimes people who have social phobia shirk away from social situations. Public speaking is such an intense fear that they'll actually turn down jobs, take different classes because of their fear of public speaking. But the fear is not just a fear of being in front of others, it's the irrational fear that they're going to embarrass themselves or be humiliated in front of other people. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, you may have seen that on some of the new kind of TLC type shows about hoarding. But it's really not a very funny disease at all, because people who suffer from OCD actually, it impacts their life significantly, and some people will even, think about or attempt suicide because their life becomes unbearable. So OCD is comprised of both obsessions and compulsions. You can have either one or both. So obsessions are intense, unwanted worries, ideas, and images that repeatedly pop up into your head. So sometimes people with obsessions will report things like wanting to stab someone even though they'd never do it, or thinking that they run someone over with their car and they have to go back and check. A compulsion is a repeated strong feeling of needing to carry out an action even though it doesn't feel like it makes sense, like washing your hands. You'll see people with OCD often have bloody hands. Or check the doors, and it's not just a few times, like many of us check the doors a few times, but this is spending hours each day checking the doors or worrying that the doors are not locked. So we all have some OCD about something, and we use that term very loosely, but in order for it to become a disorder is when you're deeply frustrated and you're not able to control the behaviors, or when the time or energy spent on these thoughts and behaviors interferes with your everyday life. We generally say it's kind of about 2 hours a day, at which point it becomes a disorder. So common OCD behaviors include fear about germs or toxins, being infected by germs, that something terrible is going to happen like fire, death, or illness, or that things have to be symmetrical in order or exact. Compulsions, which are the repetitive behaviors, so we see, as I mentioned, hand washing, bathing, toothbrushing, grooming, repeating rituals like going in and out of the door, going up and down in a chair, so you'll see them doing it multiple times, checking doors, locks, appliances, car brakes, or homework. So you'll see that the majority of people are concerned about dirt and about checking things, as well as the excessive hand washing. So as we said, common pattern, rechecking. Although you've already made sure the door is locked, you feel you must check it again and again and again. And again, this is more than just twice or 3 times. This is, 10, 20, 30 times. Another anxiety disorder, the DSM, is PTSD. You've probably heard a lot about this among victims of rape or returning soldiers. So about 10 to 35% of people who experience a trauma not only have burned-in memories, but also 4 weeks to a lifetime of repeated intrusive recall of those memories. So the memories come back when they don't want them to happen. They get nightmares, flashbacks, or other thoughts they can't get rid of. People withdraw, they become depressed, they don't want to leave the house, and you get very jumpy or over anxious, and then you feel like you might get attacked once again. People also who have PTSD have insomnia or sleep problems. It's very debilitating, and those who have it, it's very hard for them to maintain a job, maintain relationships, etc., because of the symptoms of PTSD. So who gets PTSD? Those with less control of the situation. So when things happen out of the blue and you don't expect them. Those who've had repeated traumas where it's happened more frequently. Those with certain brain differences. So there's a genetic predisposition for some people to be more vulnerable to anxiety disorders in general. Those who have less resiliency, so less social support. They've had to overcome fewer challenges in their lives. And those who get re-traumatized, so you've had multiple traumas happen to you. Some people say that with the exposure to trauma comes also post-traumatic growth. So for those that don't get PTSD, actually people who can recover from trauma actually find strength in themselves and find connections with other people. And they actually say that while they would never wish that they'd gone through that trauma, they actually feel stronger because of it. So they find some hope or something good that comes out of the trauma, and they view themselves as survivors. So how do we understand anxiety disorder? So there are different theoretical perspectives. The Freudian or psychodynamic perspective sees it as repressed impulses, which we'll discuss. Classical conditioning is an overgeneralized conditioned response. Operant conditioning is reward avoidance. Observational learning, you worry like the people around you. You see them worrying like your parents. Cognitive appraisal is uncertainty is danger, so you don't really know. You make catastrophic interpretations. And evolutionarily, we survive by avoiding danger, and a lot of the things we're afraid of are actually dangerous. So for the Freudian perspective, Sigmund Freud felt that anxiety stems from repressed childhood impulses, socially inappropriate desires, and emotional conflicts. So for example, if your Oedipal complex was not adequately resolved, there might be anxiety surrounding the desire, for your mother and the competition with your father, and that might be somewhat repressed, and therefore that's causing you anxiety. And according to psychoanalytic theories, we repress or bury these issues in the unconscious mind, but they still come up as anxiety. So it's only by kind of looking at them through free association and that we are able to kind of overcome this anxiety. In classical conditioning, you remember the experiment by Watson with little Albert, where he actually conditioned Albert to be fearful of rabbits because he associated the rabbit with a loud noise. Sometimes these conditioned responses become overgeneralized and we begin to fear all animals. And that actually happened to little Albert. He started to fear all white fluffy things, poor little fellow. So the result is then a phobia or a generalized anxiety. And operant conditioning and anxiety happens when we feel anxious in certain situations and then we leave and then we feel less anxious. So we're just avoiding the feelings of anxiety. For example, if we lock the door and we feel anxious, if we're not sure if we lock the door and then we recheck and we feel less anxiety, that has reinforced us to then go check the door again and again and again. Observational learning, that's where we emulate the behavior of other people. So experiments with both humans and monkeys show that anxiety can be acquired through observational learning. So if you see somebody else avoiding or fearing something, you might pick up that fear and adopt it. So for example, I don't know, like it's almost like anxiety is contagious. So if you see your mother feeling anxious about certain situations, you might feel that way as well. This is the way fears get passed down in families. From a cognitive perspective, these are thoughts that we about worry. We have catastrophic misinterpretations of danger in our lives. So we have hypervigilance, where we're persistently on the lookout for danger. Especially for people in PTSD, this is an issue because they're looking for danger where not necessarily danger occurs. I mean, sometimes danger is there, but we don't want to focus on it. But people with cognitive predispositions to anxiety will focus on all these cues. And so these repeated cognitions actually make anxiety worse. So some things that you can see in terms of thought processes of people with worry are believing that they can predict that bad things will happen. Irrational beliefs such as bad things don't happen to good people, so if I was hurt, I must be bad. Mistaken appraisal such as seeing aches and pains as diseases, noises as dangers, strangers as threats. And misinterpretations of facial expressions as actions of others, such as thinking they're talking about me. So it's really just a lot of distorted thinking processes. From a biological perspective, there are things that we definitely should have been afraid of. Things like snakes, heights, closed spaces, and darkness, because evolutionarily we could die from those things. Interestingly, things like fish, low places, open spaces, and bright lights are not things that we're afraid of because they can't hurt us. So, but there are things that we're not phobic of, like guns, electric wiring, and cars, which are kind of modern day things, and therefore we may not be genetically predisposed to be as afraid of or phobic of those things. So evolutionary psychologists believe that ancestors were prone to fear the items on list one because they were less likely to die before reproducing. And so it's not been time for the innate fear, like there's not been enough time, as I mentioned, for things in list 3 because we haven't kind of spread through the population yet. It's still a relatively novel thing. So studies show that identical twins, even twins who are raised separately, develop similar phobias. Some people seem to have an inborn high-strung temperament where others are more easygoing. And temperament, as we know, we've discussed, might be encoded in our genes. So genes also regulate our levels of neurotransmitters, and people with anxiety may have a gene that's associated with levels of serotonin, which is in regulator of sleep and mood. And people with anxiety also have a gene that triggers high levels of glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in the brain's alarm system, so kind of the flight or flight stuff. So traumatic experiences can burn fear circuits into the amygdala, and these circuits are later triggered and activated. Anxiety disorders include over-arousal of certain brain areas, so things will light up, and then we habituate to them. For example, here on the right you see OCD brain, which shows extra activity in the anterior cingulate gyrus, and so there's something different in the brain of somebody with OCD than somebody in the brain who does not have OCD because the same area does